Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 3, A Progress. I have a great deal of difficulty in beginning to write my portion of these pages, for I know I am not clever. I always knew that. I can remember when I was a very little girl indeed, I used to say to my doll when we were alone together, "Now, Dolly, I am not clever, you know very well, and you must be patient with me, like a dear." And so she used to sit, propped up on in a great armchair, staring at me, or not so much at me, I think, as at nothing, while I busily stitched away and told her every one of my secrets. My dear old doll, I was such a shy little thing that I seldom dared to open my lips, and never dared to open my heart to anybody else. It almost makes me cry to think what a relief it used to be to me when I came home from school of a day to run upstairs to my room and say, "Oh, you dear faithful Dolly, I knew you would be expecting me," and then to sit down on the floor, leaning on the elbow of her great chair, and tell her all I had noticed since we parted. I had always a silent way of noticing what passed before me and thinking I should like to understand it better. I have not by any means a quick understanding. When I love a person very tenderly indeed, it seems to brighten. I was brought up, from my earliest remembrance, like some of the princesses in the fairy stories, only I was not charming, by my godmother. At least I only knew her as such. She was a good, good woman. She went to church 3 times every Sunday, and to morning prayers on Wednesdays and Fridays, and to lectures whenever there were lectures, and never missed. She was handsome, and if she had ever smiled, would have been, I used to think, like an angel, but she never smiled. She was always grave and strict. She was so very good herself, I thought, that the badness of other people made her frown all her life. I felt so different from her, even making every allowance for the differences between a child and a woman. I felt so poor, so trifling, and so far off that I never could be unrestrained from her, no, could never even love her as I wished. It made me very sorry to consider how good she was and how unworthy of her I was, and I used ardently to hope that I might have a better heart, and I talked it over very often with the dear old doll, but I never loved my godmother as I ought to have loved her, and as I felt I must have loved her if I had been a better girl. This made me, I dare say, more timid and retiring than I naturally was, and cast me upon Dolly as the only friend with whom I felt at ease. But something happened when I was still quite a little thing that helped it very much. I had never heard my mamma spoken of. I had never heard of my papa either, but I felt more interested about my mamma. I had never worn a black frock that I could recollect. I had never been shown my mamma's grave. I had never been told where it was. Yet I had never been taught to pray for any relation but my godmother. I had more than once approached this subject of my thoughts with Miss Rachel, our only servant, who took my light away when I was in bed, another very good woman, but austere to me, and she had only said, "Esther, good night," and gone away and left me. Although there were 7 girls at the neighboring school where I was a day boarder, and although they called me Little Esther Summerson, I knew none of them at home. All of them were older than I, to be sure. I was the youngest there by a good deal. But there seemed to be some other separation between us besides that, and besides their being far more clever than I was, and knowing much more than I did. One of them, in the first week of my going to the school, I remember it very well, invited me home to a little party, to my great joy, but my godmother wrote a stiff letter declining for me, and I never went. I never went out at all. It was my birthday. There were holidays at school on other birthdays, none on mine. There were rejoicings at home on other birthdays, as I knew from what I heard the girls relate to one another. There were none on mine. My birthday was the most melancholy day at home in the whole year. I have mentioned that my comprehension is quickened when my affection is. My disposition is very affectionate, and perhaps I might still feel such a wound, if such a wound could be received more than once, with the quickness of that birthday. Dinner was over, and my godmother and I were sitting at the table before the fire. The clock ticked, the fire clicked, Not another sound had been heard in the room, or in the house, for I don't know how long. I happened to look timidly up from my stitching across the table at my godmother, and I saw her face looking gloomily at me. It would have been far better, little Esther, that you had had no birthday, that you had never been born. I broke out crying and sobbing. I said, "Oh, dear godmother, tell me, pray do tell me, did Mamma die on my birthday?" "No," she returned. "Ask me no more, dear, no more, child." "Oh, do pray tell me something of her. Do now, at last, dear godmother, if you please. What did I do to her? How did I lose her? Why am I so different from other children? And why is it my fault, dear godmother? No, 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 don't go away. Oh, speak to me." I was in a kind of fright beyond my grief, and I caught hold of her dress and was kneeling to her. She had been saying all the while, "Let me go." But now she stood still. Her darkened face had such power over me that it stopped me in the midst of my vehemence. I put up my trembling little hand to clasp hers, but withdrew it as she looked at me and laid it on my fluttering heart. She raised me, sat in her chair, and standing me before her, said slowly, in a cold, low voice, I see her knitted brow and pointed finger, "Your mother, Esther, is your disgrace, and you are hers. The time will come, and soon enough, when you will understand this better. I will feel it too, for no one save a woman can. I have forgiven her." But her face did not relent the wrong she did to me, and I say no more of it, though it was greater than you will ever know, than anyone will ever know but I, the sufferer. For yourself, unfortunate girl, orphaned and degraded, from the first of these evil anniversaries, pray daily that the sins of others not be visited upon your head, according to what is written, "Forget your mother, and leave all other people to forget her, who will do her unhappy child that greatest kindness. Now go." She checked me, however, as I was about to depart from her, so frozen as I was, and added this, "Submission, self-denial, diligent work are the preparations for life begun with such a shadow on it. You are different from other children, Esther, because you were not born like them. In common sinfulness and wrath, you are set apart." I went to my room and crept to bed, and laid my doll's cheek against mine, wet with tears, and holding that solitary friend upon my bosom, cried myself to sleep. Imperfect as my understanding of my sorrow was, I knew that I had brought no joy at any time to anybody's heart, and that I was to no one upon earth what Dolly was to me. Dear, dear, to think how much time we passed alone together afterwards, and how often I repeated to the doll the story of my birthday, and confided to her that I would try as hard as ever I could to repair the fault I had been born with, of which I felt guilty and yet innocent, and would strive, as I grew up, to be industrious, contented, and kind-hearted, and to do some good to some one, and win some love to myself if I could. I hope it is not self-indulgent to shed these tears as I think of it. I am very thankful, I am very cheerful, but I cannot quite help their coming to my eyes. There, I have wiped them away now, and can gone again properly. I felt the distance between my godmother and myself so much more after the birthday, and felt so sensible of filling a place in her house which ought to have been empty, that I found her more difficult of approach, though I was fervently grateful to her in my heart than ever. I felt in the same way toward my school companions. I felt in the same way towards Mrs. Rachel, who was a widow, and toward her daughter, of whom she was proud, who came to see her once a fortnight. I was very retired and quiet, and tried to be very diligent. One sunny afternoon, when I had come home from school with my books and portfolio, I was gliding upstairs to my room as usual. My godmother looked out of the parlor door and called me back. Sitting with her I found, which was very unusual indeed, a stranger, a portly, important-looking gentleman, dressed all in black, with a white cravat, large gold watch seals, a pair of gold eyeglasses, and a large seal ring upon his little finger. "This," said my godmother in an undertone, is the child. Then she said, in her naturally stern way of speaking, "This is Esther, sir." The gentleman put up his eyeglasses and said, "Come here, my dear." He shook hands with me and asked me to take off my bonnet, looking at me all the while. Well, I had complied. He said, "Ah," and afterwards, "Yes." And then, taking off his eyeglasses and folding them in a red case and leaning back in his armchair, he gave my godmother a nod. My godmother said, "You may go upstairs, Esther," and I made him a curtsy and left him. It must have been 2 years afterwards, and I was almost 14, when one dreadful night my godmother and I sat at the fireside. I was reading aloud and she was listening. I had come down at 9 o'clock, as I always did, to read the Bible to her, and was reading from St. John how our Saviour stooped down, writing with his finger in the dust, when they brought the sinful woman to him. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." I was stopped by my godmother's rising, putting her hand to her head and crying out in an awful voice from quite another part of the book, "Watch ye therefore, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch." Excuse me. In an instant, while she stood before me repeating these words, she fell down on the floor. I had no need to cry out. Her voice had sounded through the house and been heard in the street. She was laid upon her bed. For more than a week she lay there, little altered outwardly, with her old handsome resolute frown that I so well knew carved upon her face. Many and many a time in the day and in the night, with my head upon the pillow by her, and my whispers, that my whispers might be plainer to her, I kissed her, thanked her, prayed for her, asked her for her blessing and forgiveness, entreated her to give me the least sign that she knew or heard me. No, no, no. Her face was immovable to the very last, and even afterward her frown remained unsoftened. On the day after my poor good godmother was buried, the gentleman in black with the white neckcloth reappeared. I was sent for by Mrs. Rachel. "My name is Kenge," he said. "You may remember it, my child. Kenge and Carboy, Lincoln's Inn." I replied that I remembered to have seen him once before. "Pray be seated. Here, near me. Don't distress yourself. It's of no use. Mrs. Rachel, I needn't inform you, who were acquainted with the late Miss Barbara's affairs, that her means die with her, and that this young lady, now her aunt is dead—" "My aunt, sir!" "It is really no use carrying on a deception when no object is to be gained by it," said Mr. Kenge smoothly. "Aunt in fact, though not in law. Don't distress yourself, Mrs. Rachel. Our young friend has no doubt heard of the Jaundice and Jaundice." "Never," said Mrs. Rachel. "Is it possible," pursued Mr. Kenge, putting up his eyeglasses, "that our young friend never heard of Jaundice and Jaundice?" I shook my head, wondering even what it was. "Not of Jaundice and Jaundice," said Mr. Kenge, looking over his glasses at me. "Not of one of the greatest chancery suits known? Not of Jaundice and Jaundice, in itself a monument of chancery practice, in which, I would say, every difficulty, every contingency, every masterly fiction, every form of procedure known in that court is represented over and over again? Is it a cause that could not exist out of this free and great country? I should say that the aggregate of costs in Jaundice and Jaundice, Mrs. Rachel, amounts at the present hour to from 60 to 70,000 pounds, said Mr. Kenge. I felt very ignorant, but what could I do? I was entirely unacquainted with the subject, that I understood nothing about it even then. "And she really never heard of the cause?" said Mr. Kenge. "Surprising!" Miss Barnaby, sir, returned Mrs. Rachel, who is now among the seraphim. I hope so. I am sure, said Mr. Kenge politely, wished Esther only to know what would be serviceable to her, and she knows from any teaching she has had here nothing more. Well, said Mr. Kenge, upon the whole, very proper. Now to the point, addressing me. Miss Barbary, your sole relation, I am bound to observe that in law you had none. Being deceased, it is naturally not being to be expected that Mrs. Rachel— Oh, dear, no, said Miss Rachel quickly. Quite so, assented Mr. Kenge. That Mrs. Rachel should charge herself with your maintenance and support, I beg you won't distress yourself. You are in a position to receive the renewal of an offer which I was instructed to make to Mrs. Barbary some 2 years ago, which, though rejected then, was understood to be renewable under the lamentable circumstances that have since occurred. Now, if I avow that I represent in Jaundice and Jaundice and otherwise a highly humane but at the same time singular man, shall I compromise myself by any stretch of my professional caution? Said Mr. Kenge, looking calmly at us both. He appeared to enjoy everything. He appeared to enjoy beyond everything the sound of his own voice. I couldn't wonder at that, for it was mellow and full, and gave great importance to every word he uttered. He listened to himself with obvious satisfaction. I was very much impressed by him, even though before I knew that he formed himself of the model of a great lord who was his client, and that he was generally called Conversation Kenge. Mr. Jaundice, he pursued, being aware of the, I would say, desolate position of our young friend, offers to place her at a first-rate establishment where her education shall be completed, where her comfort shall be secured, where she shall be eminently qualified to discharge her duty in that station of life unto which it has pleased, shall I say, Providence to call her. My heart was filled so full, both by what he said and by his affecting manner of saying it, that I was not able to speak, though I tried. Mr. Jaundice, he went on, makes no condition beyond expressing his expectations that our young friend will not at any time remove herself from the establishment in question without his knowledge and concurrence, that she will faithfully apply herself to the acquisition of those accomplishments upon the exercise of which she will be ultimately dependent, that she will tread in the paths of virtue and honor, and so forth. I was still less able to speak than before. Now, what does our young friend say? Proceeded Mr. Kenge. Take time. I pause for her reply, but take time. What the desolate subject of such an offer tried to say, I need not repeat. What she did say, I could more easily tell, if it were worth the telling. What she felt and will feel to her dying hour, I could never relate. The interview took place at Windsor, where I had passed, as far as I knew, my whole life. On that day, amply provided with all necessities, I left it, inside the stagecoach, for Reading. Mrs. Rachel was too good to feel any emotion at parting, but I was not so good and wept bitterly. I thought that I ought to have known her better after so many years, and ought to have made myself enough of a favorite with her to make her sorry then, when she gave me one cold parting kiss upon my forehead, like a thaw drop from a stone porch. It was a very frosty day. I felt so miserable and self-reproachful that I clung to her and told her it was my fault. I knew that she could say goodbye so easily. No, Esther, she returned. It is your misfortune. The coach was at the little lawn gate, and thus I left her with a sorrowful heart. She went in before my boxes were lifted to the coach roof, and shut the door. My godmother had left Miss Rachel all the little property she possessed, and there was to be a sale. A day or two before, I had wrapped the dear old doll in her own shawl, and quietly laid her, I am half ashamed to tell it, in the garden earth under the tree that shaded my old window. When the house was out of sight, I sat forward on the low seat to look out of the high window, watching the frosty trees that were like beautiful pieces of spar, and the fields all smooth and white with last night's snow. There was a gentleman in the coach who sat on the opposite seat and looked very large in a quantity of wrappings, but he sat gazing out of the other window and took no notice of me. I thought of my dead godmother, of the night when I read of her frowning so fixedly and sternly in her bed, of the strange place I was going to, of the people I should find there, and what they would be like, and what they would say to me, when a voice in the coach gave me a terrible start. It said, "What the devil are you crying for?" I was so frightened that I lost my voice. I could only answer in a whisper, "Me, sir?" For of course I knew it must have been the gentleman in the quantity of wrappings, though he was still looking out of his window. "Yes, you," he said, turning round. "I didn't know I was crying, sir," I faltered. "But you are," said the gentleman. "Look here." He came quite opposite me, and from the other corner of the coach, brushed one of his large furry cuffs across my eyes, but without hurting me, and showed me that it was wet. "And what are you crying for?" said the gentleman. "Don't you want to go there?" "Where, sir?" "Where? Why, wherever it is you are going." Excuse me, said the gentleman. "I am very glad to go there, sir," I answered. "Well, then, look glad," said the gentleman. I thought he was very strange, or at least that what I could see of him was very strange, for he was wrapped up to the chin, and his face was almost hidden in a fur cap, with broad fur straps at the side of his head, fastened under his chin. But I was composed again, and not afraid of him. So I told him that I thought I must have been crying because of my godmother's death, and because of Mrs. Rachel's not being sorry to part with me. "Confound Miss Rachel," said the gentleman. "Let her fly away on a high wind on a broomstick." I began to be really afraid of him now, and looked at him with the greatest astonishment, but I thought that he had pleasant enough eyes, although he kept muttering to himself in an angry manner and calling Mrs. Rachel names. He did not speak to me any more until he got out of the carriage, or until he got out of the coach a little way, short of reading, which when he advised me to be a good girl and to be studious, and shook hands with me. I must say I was relieved by his departure. When the coach stopped, a very neat lady looked up at the window and said, "Miss Donny." "No, ma'am, Esther Summerson." "That is quite right," said the lady, "Miss Donny." I now understood that she introduced herself by that name, and begged Miss Donny's pardon for my mistake, and pointed out my boxes. At her request, under the direction of a very neat maid, they were put outside a very small green carriage, and then Miss Donny, the maid, and I got inside, and were driven away. "Everything is ready for you, Esther," said Miss Donny, "and the scheme of your pursuits has been arranged in exact accordance with the wishes of your guardian, Mr. Jarndyce. Did you say, ma'am, of your guardian, Mr. Jarndyce?" said Miss Donny. I was so bewildered that Miss Donny thought the cold had been too severe on me, and lent me her smelling bottle. "Do you know my guardian, Mr. Jarndyce, ma'am?" I asked after a good deal of hesitation. "Not personally, Esther," said Miss Donny, "merely through his solicitors, Messrs. Kenge and Carboy of London. A very superior gentleman, Mr. Kenge, truly eloquent indeed." I felt this to be very true, but was too confused to attend to it. Our speedy arrival at our destination, before I had time to recover myself, increased my confusion, and I never shall forget the uncertain and unreal air of everything at Greenleaf, Miss Donny's house, that afternoon. But I soon became used to it. I was so adapted to the routine of Greenleaf before long that I seemed to have been there a great while, and almost to have dreamed rather than really lived my old life at my godmother's. Nothing could be more precise, exact, and orderly than Greenleaf. There was a time for everything, all round the dial of the clock, and everything was done at its appointed moment. We were 12 boarders, and there were 2 Miss Donnies, twins. It was understood that I would have to depend by and by on my qualifications as a governess, and I was not only instructed in everything that was taught at Greenleaf, but was very soon engaged in helping to instruct others. As I began to know more, I taught more, and so, in course of time, I had plenty to do, which I was very fond of doing, because it made the dear girls fond of me. At last, whenever a new pupil came who was a little downcast and unhappy, she was so sure indeed, I don't know why, to make a friend of me, that all newcomers were confided to my care. They said I was so gentle, but I am sure they were. I passed at Greenleaf 6 happy, quiet years. I never saw any face there, thank heaven, on my birthday that would have been better if I had never been born. When the day came round, it brought me so many tokens of affection and remembrance that my room was beautiful with them from New Year's Day to Christmas. In those 6 years I had never been away, except on visits at holiday time to the neighborhood. After the first 6 months or so, I had taken Miss Donnie's advice in reference to the propriety of writing to Mr. Kenge, to say that I was happy and grateful, and with her approval I had written such a letter. I had received a formal answer acknowledging its receipt and saying, "We note the contents thereof, which shall be duly communicated to our client." After that, I sometimes heard Miss Donnie and her sister mention how regularly my accounts were paid, and about twice a year I ventured to write a similar letter. I always received by return of post exactly the same answer in the same round hand, with the signature of Kenge and Carboy in another writing, which I supposed to be Mr. Kenge's. "6 quiet years. I find I am saying it for the second time. I had passed at Greenleaf, seeing in those around me, as it might be in a looking-glass, every stage of my own growth and change. There, when one November morning I received the letter, I omit the date. Old Square, Lincoln's Inn, Madam, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, our client, Mr. Jarndyce, being about to reese into his house under an order of the Court of Chancery, a ward of the court in this cause, for whom he wishes to secure an eligible companion, directs us to inform you that he will be glad of your services in the aforementioned capacity. We have arranged for your being forwarded carriage free per 8 o'clock coach from Reading on Monday morning next to White Horse Collar, Piccadilly, London, where one of our clerks will be waiting to convey you to our offices above. We are Madam's obedient servants, Kenge and Carboy. Miss Esther Summerson." Oh, never, never, never shall I forget the emotion this letter caused in the house. It was so tender in them to care so much for me. It was so gracious in that father who had not forgotten me, to have made my orphan way so smooth and easy, and to have inclined so many youthful natures toward me, that I could hardly bear it. The letter gave me only 5 days' notice of my removal, when every minute added to the proofs of love and kindness that were given me in those 5 days, and when at last the morning came, and when they took me through all the rooms that I might see them for the last time, and when they all surrounded me with their parting presents, and clung to me weeping and cried, "What shall we do when dear, dear Esther's gone?" And when I tried to tell them how I blessed and thanked them, every one, what a heart I had. And when the 2 Miss Donnies grieved as much to part with me as the least among them, and when the maids said, "Bless you, miss, wherever you go," and when the ugly, lame old gardener, who I thought had hardly noticed me in all those years, came panting after the coach to give me a little nosegay of geraniums, and told me I had been the light of his eyes, what a heart I had then! But of course, I soon considered that I must not take tears where I was going. After all, that had been done for me. Therefore, of course, I made myself sob less and persuaded myself to be quiet by saying very often, Esther, now you really must. This will not do. I cheered myself up pretty well at last. When I had cooled my eyes with lavender water, it was time to watch for London. I was quite persuaded that we were there when we were 10 miles off, and when we really were there, that we should never get there. However, when we began to jolt upon a stone pavement, and particularly when every other conveyance seemed to be running into us, and we seemed to be running into every other conveyance, I began to believe that we really were approaching the end of our journey. Very soon afterwards, we stopped. A young gentleman addressed me from the pavement and said, I am from Kenge and Carboys, miss, of Lincoln's Inn. If you please, sir, said I. He was obliging, and as he handed me into a fly, after superintending the removal of my boxes, I asked him whether there was a great fire anywhere, for the streets were so full of dense brown smoke that scarcely anything could be seen. Oh, no, miss, he said. This is London particular. This is a London particular. I had never heard of such a thing. A fog, miss. Oh, indeed, said I. We drove slowly through the dirtiest and darkest streets that ever were seen in the world, I thought, and in such a distracting state of confusion that I wondered how people kept their senses until we passed into sudden quietude under an old gateway and drove on through a silent square until we came to an odd nook in a corner where there was an entrance up a steep, broad flight of stairs like an entrance to a church. And there really was a churchyard outside under some cloisters, for I saw the gravestones from the staircase window. This was Kenge and Carboys. The young gentleman showed me through to an outer office, into Mr. Kenge's room. There was no one in it, and politely put an armchair for me by the fire. He then called my attention to a little looking-glass hanging from a nail on the side of the chimney-piece. In case you should wish to look at yourself, miss, after the journey, as you're going before the Chancellor. Not that it's a requisite, I am sure, said the young gentleman civilly. Going before the Chancellor? I said, startled for a moment. Only a matter of form, miss, returned my young gentleman. Mr. Kenge is in court now. He left his compliments, and would you look over the paper, which the young gentleman gave me as he spoke. He then stirred the fire and left me. Everything was so strange, the stranger from its being night in the daytime, the candles burning with a light flame, and looking raw and cold, that I read the words in the newspaper without knowing what they meant, and found myself reading the same words repeatedly. As it was no use going on in that way, I put the paper down, took a peep at my bonnet in the glass to see if it was neat, and looked at the room, and at the piles of writings, and at the bookcase full of the most inexpensive looking books that ever had anything to say for themselves. Then I went on thinking, and the fire went on burning, and the candles went on flickering and guttering for 2 hours. At last Mr. Kenge came. He was not altered, but he was surprised to see how altered I was, and appeared quite pleased. As you are going to be the companion of the young lady who is now in the Chancellor's private room, Miss Summerson, he said, we thought it well that you should be in attendance also. You will not be discomposed by the Lord Chancellor, I dare say? No, sir, I said. I don't think I shall. So Mr. Kenge gave me his arm, and we went round the corner, under a colonnade, and in at the side door. So we came, along a passage, into a comfortable sort of room where a young lady and a young gentleman were standing near a great loud roaring fire talking. They both looked up when I came in, and I saw, in the young lady, with the fire shining upon her, such a beautiful girl, with rich golden hair, such soft blue eyes, and such a bright, innocent, trusting face. Miss Ada, said Mr. Kenge, this is Miss Summerson. She came to meet me with a smile of welcome and her hand extended, but seemed to change her mind in a moment and kissed me. In short, she had such a natural, captivating, winning manner that in a few minutes we were sitting up in the window seat talking together as free and happy as could be. What a load off my mind! It was so delightful to know that she could confide in me and like me. It was so good of her and so encouraging to me. The young gentleman was her distant cousin, she told me, and his name Richard Carstone. He was a handsome youth with an ingenious face and a most engaging laugh. And after she had called him up to where we sat, he stood by us talking gaily, like a light-hearted boy. He was very young, not more than 19 then, if quite so much, but nearly 2 years older than she was. They were both orphans, and had never met before that day. All our three coming together for the first time in such an unusual place was a thing to talk about, and we talked about it. We conversed in a low tone, because a fully dressed gentleman in a bag wig frequently came in and out, and when he did so, we could hear a drawling sound in the distance, which he said was one of the counsel, in our case addressing the Lord Chancellor. Presently we heard a bustle and a tread of feet, and Mr. Kenge said that the court had risen and his lordship was in the next room. The gentleman in the bag wig opened the door almost directly and requested Mr. Kenge to come in. Upon that, we all went into the next room, Mr. Kenge first, with my darling. It is so natural to me now that I can't help writing it, and there, plainly dressed in black and sitting in an armchair at a table near the fire, was his lordship, whose robe, trimmed with beautiful gold lace, was thrown upon another chair. He gave us a searching look as we entered, but his manner was both courtly and kind. The gentleman in the bag wig laid bundles of papers on his lordship's table, and his lordship silently selected one and turned over the leaves. "Miss Clare," said the Lord Chancellor. "Miss Ada Clare." Mr. Kenge presented her, and his lordship begged her to sit down near him. Then he admired her, and was interested by her, even I could see in a moment. "The jaundice in question," said the Lord Chancellor, still turning over leaves, "is jaundice of Bleak House." "Jaundice of Bleak House, my lord," said Mr. Kenge. "A dreary name," said the Lord Chancellor. "But not a dreary place at present, my lord," said Mr. Kenge. "And Bleak House," said his lordship, "is in Hertfordshire, my lord." "Mr. Jaundice of Bleak House is not married?" said his lordship. "He is not, my lord," said Mr. Kenge. A pause. "Young Mr. Richard Carstone is present," said the Lord Chancellor, glancing toward him. Richard bowed and stepped forward. "Hum," said the Lord Chancellor, turning over more leaves. "Mr. Jaundice of Black House, my lord," Mr. Kenge observed in a low voice, "if I may venture to remind your lordship, provides a suitable companion for Miss Ada Clare. This is the young lady, Miss Summerston." His lordship acknowledged my curtsy very graciously. "Miss Summerson is not related to any party in the cause, I think?" "No, my lord." Mr. Kenge leant over before it was quite said and whispered. His lordship, with his eyes upon the papers, listened, nodded twice or thrice, turned over more leaves, and did not look toward me again until we were going away. Mr. Kenge now retired, and Richard with him, to where I was near the door, leaving my pet. So it is so natural to me again that I can't help it, sitting near the Lord Chancellor, with whom his lordship spoke a little apart, asking her, as she told me afterwards, whether she had well reflected on the proposed arrangement, and if she thought she would be happy under the roof of Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House, and why she thought so. Presently he rose courteously and released her, and then he spoke for a minute or two with Richard Carstone. "Very well," said his lordship aloud, "I shall make the order. Mr. Jarndyce of Bleak House has chosen, so far as I may judge," and this is when he looked at me, "a very good companion for the young lady, and the arrangement altogether seems the best of which the circumstances admit." He dismissed us pleasantly, and we all went out, very much obliged to him for being so affable and polite. When he got under the colonnade, Mr. Kenge remembered that he must go back for a moment to ask a question, and left us in the fog. "Well," said Mr. Richard Carstone, "that's over. And where do we go next, Miss Summerston?" "Don't you know?" I said. "Not in the least," said he. "And don't you know, my love?" I asked Ada. "No," said she. "Don't you?" "Not at all," said I. We looked at one another, half laughing, when a curious little old woman in a squeezed bonnet and carrying a reticule came curtsying and smiling up at us with an air of great ceremony. "Oh," she said, "the wards in jaundice. Very happy I am, sure to have the honour. It is a good omen for youth and hope and beauty when they find themselves in this place and don't know what's to come of it." "Mad," whispered Richard, not thinking she could hear him. "Right, mad, young gentleman." She smiled so quickly that he was quite abashed. "I was a ward myself. I was not mad at that time." Excuse me. Curtsying low and smiling between every little sentence. "I had youth and hope. I believe beauty. It matters very little now. Neither of the three served or saved me. I have the honor to attend the court regularly with my documents. I expect a judgment shortly. On the day of judgment, I have discovered that the sixth seal mentioned in the Revelation is the Great Seal. It has been open a long time. Pray accept my blessing." As Ada was a little frightened, I said to humor the poor old lady that we were much obliged to her. "Yes," she said mincingly, "I imagine so. I shall confer estates on both. I expect a judgment shortly, on the day of judgment. This is a good omen for you. Accept my blessing." She stopped at the bottom of the steep, broad flight of stairs, but we looked back as we went up, and she was still there, saying with a curtsy and a smile between every little sentence, "Youth and hope and beauty and chancery. Ha! Pray accept my blessing." And that is the end of chapter 3.